Okay, so now we are live.
Great, wonderful. So we are live. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And before we start, I just want to say thank you again to Swash for hosting all of us and Chloe for organizing this event. It's been a real pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I just want to start off by saying that this is going to be recorded as well. So for those of you who can't make it or want to send it to your friends, this will be recorded, and we'll have that ready for all of you later on. Great. So I'm going to start off the panel. My name is Rachel Wolfson. I'm a journalist in the blockchain and crypto space. I've been covering the blockchain and cryptocurrency space since 2017. I've been writing for publications that include HuffPost, Forbes, Cointelegraph, so a variety of publications. I also have a book on Amazon, which is it's a Bitcoin ebook. It's a Bitcoin book for beginners. Tim Draper wrote the foreword so for those of you interested in learning more about Bitcoin for beginners, it's on Amazon. Feel free to check it out. And yeah, that's just a little bit about myself. So I'm going to turn over the mic to the other ladies that we have on the panel to introduce themselves. Victoria, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Chloe. So I'm Victoria Thompson. I'm a technology and intellectual property lawyer by background, and I've spent probably more than a decade in financial services and working inside banks and helping them come to grips with what blockchain and the potential it has within financial services and what this new form of digital assets are. And I've been very fortunate in that I've worked across Asia, Europe, UK, and the US as well in that adventure. And then most recently, I've been trying to be an entrepreneur and helping think about how tokens and how we can distribute aid with my company Aurora, and also setting up the Digital Pound Foundation, which is looking at how you create a digital pound in the UK and bring to fore what central digital banking currencies could be. So yeah, that's me.
Wonderful. Megan, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Megan Klimen. I am a co-founder of the Filecoin Foundation, and my background before this is all about entrepreneurial endeavors. And so my most recent company before the Filecoin Foundation was a biotech company, which really really sparked my interest in all of the different ways that we can do data sharing for the.
I think Megan.
Okay, we've lost Megan. I'll jump in.
Issues. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I am Ioana Surpateanu, currently chief strategist at DIA Association, which is an open source financial information platform and an oracle. We are integrated with most layer 1 and layer 2 chains, and we have a very interesting approach when it comes to the way we source, validate the data. The way we source and validate the data. Sorry, I just saw the screen moving, so I stopped for a second. And we have customizable products depending on the end user, whether we speak about decentralized applications on chain, obviously, or off chain applications. I have a pretty eclectic background, I would say. So prior to this, I was at Citigroup for 4 years. So I could actually say that I was adjacently involved in crypto since 2017, because my job at Citigroup was to, on the one hand, work with some of the business teams and market, for instance, market infrastructure investment teams, in creating a strategy for innovation, while simultaneously interacting with policymakers and regulators here in Brussels, where I'm based, to figure out a way to enable all of these innovations stemming from the TradFi sector. And prior to that, I was actually in politics, which gives me a very interesting filter and let's just say a unique analyzer when it comes to what's currently happening. And it's been funny to see how everyone has turned political analysts overnight, and the way they interpret this whole mess we are currently in, which might have been brought in by propaganda enabled by Web 2 platforms. So maybe we can touch on that later. So that's all about me. Over to Chloe. Thanks for organizing this, Chloe.
Yeah, thanks so much. I love that. That's already giving me some ideas and, some hot topics to talk about. But yeah, thanks so much for all of you being here. And yeah, as I'm sure some of the viewers already know, I'm Chloe. I'm working at Swash, so I'm basically leading the charge when it comes to marketing. My background is also in marketing and also partly in art. So I have sort of one side in NFTs as well. But I've been in the blockchain space officially since about 2014. Not holding since then, unfortunately, but getting interested in the technology, getting interested in, I guess there is a kind of philosophical element behind like how it started, given 2008 and everything. And then I gradually started working as a freelancer, basically creating more like long form content for different projects. So I got to see in a very tangible way how blockchain could sort of enter and disrupt different industries, like everything from energy to art to real estate, like kind of all different areas. And you see there's a lot of things that hadn't quite been tapped into even back in 2017. And I mean, now we're starting to see some of those ideas are really taking form. So I've been with Swash for what feels like 10 years, because things change very quickly in this space. And since joining, we've grown our user base to about 250,000 users. For those who don't know, Swash is a data movement and is the first and largest data union, which is basically a way for people to come together and take ownership over their data. At the moment, you can do this with Swash through a browser plugin, which takes just a few minutes to set up. And by doing that, you basically join this union. And I mean that there are many sort of different angles we can talk about what that means, and I'm sure we'll cover some of them today. But I'm very excited for this panel just because I know that everyone here, and Megan, of course, when she reconnects too, sort of coming in with their own expertise and looking at this from policy perspective, regulation, tech, maybe even arts, whatever it might be. So there's a lot of different opinions here, and I'm very excited to for the conversation, and also to see if anyone watching has any comments. Then we're going to have time for a Q&A towards the end as well. So thanks. I'll leave it to you, Rachel.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chloe, Victoria, and Ioana, and Megan. Megan will be rejoining us, I'm assuming. So, but until then, we are going to get the panel started. So welcome again to the Women in Web3 panel. Oh, there's Megan. Hello, Megan.
Hi, guys. So sorry about that.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
We summoned you.
We did. So to start the panel off, I just want you ladies to kind of take some time to explain how the data economy relates to Web3 and how this is different from Web2. So anybody can start us off. Feel free to answer that question and get us started. Anyone?
Yeah, I'll go if you want.
Sure.
So, I mean, there are obviously a variety of angles via which we can analyze this. So let's, in basic terms, unpack all of the things that you mentioned: Web 2, Web 3, data economy. Again, we don't have the time here to go through every single step of the evolution of the internet to better understand what makes Web 1 different from Web 2, etc., and from Web 3. But simplistically put, Web 1 was designed, the first implementation of the internet, the design there was user-centric. Users were creators, were content distributors. It was about collaboration, user centricity. It wasn't so much about monetization, which is what led to Web 2, where they managed, and by that I mean the Web 2 online platforms managed to find a monetization model that was aggregated around a couple of entities. And in time, the Web 2 model started acting against the data generator. What do I mean by that? So, and in order to explain that, let's go a little bit and explain what a data economy is, right? So it's an ecosystem built around the exchange of data and data aggregation with the subsequent value extraction mechanisms. So in Web 2, these value extraction mechanisms were centered on the vendors who extract data from the users, monetize on it without compensating the user whatsoever, and on top of that, feed that data into, let's just say, behavioral change generating algorithms to perfect the monetization mechanisms they already use. Now, Web3 is trying to cancel all of the aforementioned paradigms because they've understood that a very clear monetization model can be, the proponents of Web3 understood that a clear and very valid monetization model can be built, but it has to be redesigned with the user in the center. So the user can actually utilize decentralized tools and Web3 tools and applications to monetize on the data, or at least partly monetize on the data, but also control what type of data he or she reveals and how, and try to realign incentives so that data is not then used to manipulate the data originator. I'm sorry if this all sounds very philosophical, and maybe we'll go deeper into that later, and I can expand on the concepts. This is the interrelation between all of the steps in the evolution of the internet. I actually like to, I will bring the metaverse in the equation now, because I look at the metaverse as the first tangible implementation of Web3 tech. So you can actually see what Web3 via specific tools, for instance, NFTs that give you digital rights and digital ownership, what Web3 can be all about and how the user is empowered in a variety of ways. So this is how I analyze and I filter through all of these paradigms. And I believe that we have the chance via Web3 to, like I said, realign incentives so that the user gets to benefit from all of the data he or she produces, because data is an economic asset. And because of that, we have come to a situation where a few platforms monopolize this whole data economy. And we obviously need to change it.
Yeah, I super duper agree with you, Ioana, and like,
awesome. Thank you.
Well, and I think that like one of the things that's really powerful about the technology, just like expand on what you said a little bit, like it's both the ability to align incentives, right? Like blockchain's like a fundamentally new, technology that lets you share data and make sure that you're, that you are rewarding the people that you want to reward with that sharing of data, right? Like, so it's like inherently more user centric. And I think that it also then creates whole new models of being able to monetize the sharing of data that wasn't available before. Before I lost power on my painfully old MacBook that I should replace, I was midway through my introduction where I was talking about one of the things that really, really excites me about Web3 and the ability to share data in these new ways is the ability to share scientific data that in the past, there wasn't good monetization strategies or incentives for sharing this data that you want to be open and free, but truthfully, it costs money to host things. It's there are like privacy concerns, and so blockchain really fundamentally changes all that and really like opens up an avenue for there to be massive advances in basic science, because you can have these like communal data sets where you're doing the same analysis on the same sets of data. That's like personal passion in there, but definitely like Filecoin is like Filecoin is a layer 1 solution for data storage. And so we are thinking all the time, the Filecoin Foundation, about the different ways we can share data. We think of Filecoin as like the Airbnb of data, like letting people distribute data in new and novel methods. So not just like the monetization, but just like how access changes, because you can hone in the way you want people to access and rewards to work in that data without having to have a third party kind of control it.
I think for me, what's really exciting about moving forward with going from Web 2 to Web 3 is it's really an opportunity to really think about data in a different way. For obviously, data has been around as long as anybody's been able to write anything down or capture it in some form or another. And our laws have always seen it as akin to property. And depending on who you are and how you capture it, you've had different rights around all of that. But now with the power of the technology that is evolving, we can do different things with it. And I think then it becomes really interesting about who owns those pieces of information, how it's stored, how it's shared. All of these new rules that we need to have are going to have to be a reimagining of the law. And sadly, as a lawyer, I find that quite interesting. And therefore, thinking about how you then monetize that, share that, do all the things that you want to do with it, there really is a reimagining that's required, because we still are hanging on to very quite archaic ways of thinking about data and treating it as property. So even in the UK law, you don't actually own data. It's not only when you actually reduce it into a database and you put the sweat of the brow, is the phrase that the law still uses, that you then actually capture rights around it. So it's very bizarre. It's still linking it to somebody writing something down, almost like a monk writing a Bible. It's very bizarre. Whereas now, when we think about how this can all move forward and how you can reward people and incentivize people, everything that everyone's talked about so far, you really do need to think about this in a different way. And what's really exciting as well with what Swash is doing from my perspective is the concept of a data union, and having the rights and ideas of what a union is and applying that into this new world that we're creating, whether it's in a metaverse or in other ways, is really interesting.
I'll just jump in there as well, because I think like the idea of a union is something which a lot of people can get behind. And though, I mean, maybe looking in the more recent years, I think unions have sort of fallen out of fashion in the real world in a sense. But there is that need to have a kind of, I guess, like a unionization of a new industry, much like we would have had, you know, during the Industrial Revolution or something. Like there are certain standards around work, and whether it's like working in a factory and not, you know, having your arm chopped off or something in like Oliver Twist's London or whatever it might be, that what we take for granted now as standard had to be campaigned for essentially back in the day. So I think what we're like, part of what this conversation is even doing is about like exploring what those avenues can be and like what those standards should be. And I mean, I'm personally, although like given what Swash is doing as an example, where we're very much centered on this kind of people power idea, and it is kind of like by the people for the people kind of concept. I think with that, there's a lot to explore about what it will look like when people do have a much more concrete idea of how data is used. I mean, on like a more mainstream level, how data is used and, you know, what it means to have ownership over it. That, of course, opens a lot of doors for very philosophical questions. But I think, yeah, I mean, I personally think the big difference between Web 2 and Web 3 is that in Web 2, there's just simply the idea that the select few have control and have sort of that authority over what's happening, whereas the shift into Web 3 is more about not repeating those problems and trying to bring power and authority back to the masses. So I think if we're sort of proceeding with those that kind of ethos in mind, then we're heading in the right direction. I'm inherently optimistic about what's to come.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thanks, ladies, for defining what Web3 data means. I think, Chloe, just based on what you were saying, we should now go into, you know, specific use cases of how Web3 data is being utilized and the role that data plays with Web3 applications. So that being said, can we just talk a little bit about specific use cases in data here? And anyone can go ahead.
Go ahead, Megan, because I started last time. So go ahead, over to you.
Oh, over to me? Sure. Well, I think I might have already jumped into this because in the, you know, excitement that I have over having more collaborative scientific data and having a data commons, you know, definitely in science, there's a reproducibility crisis, and being able to look at a common data set for doing analysis, to know that, you know, you're not just trying to perform the same experiment in the same way, but that you're actually analyzing the same set of data, is incredibly powerful. I think you know, expanding a little bit on, you know, a point you touched on, Chloe, and you, Victoria, too, like around like the way data changes with different ownership models. I think that like it's just inherently obvious that a lot of our views about how data is used needs to change in the world of machine learning, because where your training sets are going to be significantly more important than whatever, like neural net you come up with to do that. And so it's like whoever owns that training set, and like the people whose data are contributing to that training set are not, or most of the time not even aware that they are. There's a coffee shop down the street from a place that I used to live that I found out somebody there was getting their PhD at Stanford at the time and used the camera in the coffee shop to do a lot of the facial recognition. It's called the brainwash data set because it was the name of the coffee shop. And that is like the fundamental facial recognition training set that is used by the Chinese government. And so like 5 years of me like putting an overcoat over my pajamas and getting coffee is part of this fundamental training set. And maybe that makes people feel okay. Maybe you feel squidgy about that, but like I think that it really is a very big reimagining of what data is in terms of property, and like how we are thinking about that in the exchange of data.
Megan, I just want to jump in and ask, like, how was that something which they kind of told you about after it had happened, or it was only in your industry that you discovered?
I read a New York Times article about it, and I was like,
that makes it worse.
Yeah, totally. Actually, a roommate sent me the New York Times article. It was like, look, our coffee shop was used to create the data set that is now the underpinnings of all the facial recognition used for the CCP.
Have you been to China since then?
Not
out of curiosity.
I know. Maybe like every camera like will zoom in on me. But yeah, I haven't been since then. Only before.
But I think people is a really good point that's raised that right now I don't think people quite are aware of what's happening with their information, and I do think there is a desperate need to educate people about this. And if we are going into this new kind of vision of what it could be, there needs to be a serious policy engagement around that and around what we want that to look like. And if we are going to redraw the rule book, how are we going to do that? Because classically, it's the lobbying power that then influences that to shape it to work for them in the most rewarding way. And I think there's a real opportunity here for people who want to lead the way on this to be very inclusive in how they do that by design. I mean, from a financial services perspective, for example, my former employer, Barclays, they know how 1 in 4 pounds in the UK is spent. They have that information. They have that through their merchant acquisition and through all of their lines. They know that about you, and they know if you happen to be a customer with them. They're the biggest card provider in the UK. They have one of the largest account books, both corporate and retail. The information they have is massive. And that is used in various ways internally to help its customers and to also make more money for the business. And what does that mean? But then you can look at, especially in the healthcare space, after going through a global pandemic, the sharing of clinical data for research to enable the production of the vaccines and to have the information. We've gone through a massive experience on a global level to show actually when we collaborate and when we share information, what it can really achieve. And so when you look at, say, like the Japanese government for years has had medical research data sharing, so to making sure academic research can be done, that's been entrenched in legislation for one of the longest times. But I think that's where we should be moving. And if we can create technology standards around how, like on a commons license basis of how that can be done, this could advance huge amounts of research that for especially with diseases that in one country don't have a lot of data sets, but when it's more prevalent in others, that can be really interesting. So that's hugely important. And also, if you can reward people for sharing that data and making that available, that's really important, I think.
Right, Victoria. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Rachel. Go ahead. No, it's fine.
I was just going to say, Victoria brings up very important points about data incentives. I think that's a big part of Web3 and about sharing data as well. But Ioana, go ahead and
yeah, I just wanted to second everything that was said. On the people being en masse, okay, educated about what data rights they have, which I think they have started to once GDPR was enforced. I think this should be done in parallel. So this mass education should be done in parallel with creating the tools that would enable them to reverse the situation they are in. We are all in, right? Because no one, let's be honest about it, no one wants to take on additional responsibility. I mean, owning your private keys and being fully responsible for your finances and fully independent and for your data ownership, that's all great. But you need to build models that facilitate that, that make it easy to use, because no one wants to spend all of their time amalgamating all of this and managing all of these all of the sudden acquired rights and all of these new ownership angles. People want to delegate. I mean, this is why Web 2 happened. People want to delegate. They don't want to hold their server. They don't want to curate their content. So you need to create these models that in lockstep with education will empower the masses, as Chloe was saying earlier. And another point, and then I'll actually move to Web3 and give you an example of what we do with oracles and how data is deployed there. So the EU just launched a Data Governance Act, or the EU Data Act today. Negotiations start on that. What they're trying to do is create a data union within the EU that would enable all sorts of entities to share data more freely, right? And by all sorts of entities, I mean users, small businesses, big businesses, etc. But it is a very clear EU focus. So we're starting to see, going back to your earlier point, Chloe, about re-empowering the masses, it's going to be a little bit more complex than that, I think, because people understand that a lot of value extraction happens out of data, and it's going to be used as a geopolitical tool as well. And we're starting to see that with the EU. Obviously, this move is clearly against all of the American tech companies. No offense, Rachel. This is the EU's doing, and this is what they have been planning for a while. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what types of symbioses are created as a result of people suddenly being more empowered around the data they can monetize upon, and then all sorts of jurisdictions creating these data unions for businesses. Now, going back to Web3, and I think it's clear to me at least, it's clear that we currently do not operate in a fully fledged Web3 model. We operate in a hybrid Web 2, Web3 model. So decentralized finance, right, is a good example of let's just say Web3, fully native Web3 ecosystem built around finance and decentralizing finance and disintermediating various financial processes and intermediaries. And if the ideal outcome and the natural progression, I would say, is to have a decentralized capital markets at one point, then oracles will be one of the most important angles in there, or instruments in there. Why? So for instance, what do oracles do? They create this off-chain, on-chain link. So they transport data from off-chain environments to on-chain environments and vice versa, if the case requires it, or if customers want it. This is vital. Why? Because smart contracts are confined to operating on the network they are designed to operate on. But in order to power this explosion of DeFi applications, you need to have access to off-chain data. And this is what oracles do. Moreover, oracles, it's probably, oracles, because they're such a vital part of the DeFi infrastructure, in this case, because we're talking about DeFi, they're also a very relevant element when it comes to security. And moreover, they're also a conveyor of truth, because they represent a particular part of the market at a given price, which represents the truth. Maybe that market is manipulated. Maybe some of the trades are manipulated when that happens, but it is the truth that different DApps require in order to execute functions. imagine that at scale. So this is currently only happening for DeFi. I mean, oracles normally do price feeds and now verifiable randomness for games. Imagine this at scale. So imagine if we reach that ideal open economic system, so decentralized capital markets, where oracles would actually be the bridge to all types of off-chain to on-chain data. So that's going to be huge. And this is why the way oracles are designed currently is so important, because you cannot just rely on the oracle provider. You need to have input from the community. You need to ensure certain levels of transparency and involve more than just one entity to provide the truth. So yeah, this is one of the, I would say, Web3 data application in the form of an oracle, which is actually a smart contract, that shows just how sophisticated this ecosystem is, and how that it will become even more sophisticated as we progressively move towards a wider open economic state. So yeah, I gave my part on the oracles. Happy to touch on something else, but I'll pass it back to you.
I was just going to jump in there as well, because I think there are a few, like with kind of all of those angles that we've kind of compared about how there's kind of this variation around the world as well regarding how people are looking at data. And then I wonder if maybe in Web3, the opportunity is to kind of bring all those different approaches together. Because I mean, for example, we're talking about China, we're talking about Europe, we're talking about the US. And I wonder if out of all of the experience we have here, as we're quite a distributed panel right now, if anyone has a sort of, if they've seen any case where that country or that entity or whatever it might be is really going the right direction, that maybe the rest of us can draw from. Because I mean, like, I think GDPR was kind of used as that benchmark originally. And I wonder if, 3-4 years later, if we all would agree that that's the best approach, out of curiosity. And then I wonder also, in the realm of Web3, and even, for example, with smart contracts, is that something which, if it's possible to kind of, even take it a step further regarding privacy, transparency? As you were all talking, I'm happy for anyone to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, like this might be a little bit to the left of the question you were asking, but like, I don't know if I think that there's a government example that's like the direction that we're going. And I think one of the things that's really powerful and awesome about the potential that Web3 has, and the potential of specifically building on blockchain, is that you can be less reliant on on a particular government to be enforcing these standards, and you can really have like a marketplace around different solutions. I mean, like Ioana said, it's it is a big pain in the butt to like keep all of your own private keys, I don't want to, I use my ledger for various crypto things, and it's a pain. I'm so glad that I keep my US dollars in a bank account that that's like easy to use and has like a customer service person, and I think that the thing that's really fundamentally different is the ability to opt in to the level of privacy versus convenience that you want. I really hope that we would be able to look back to the world that Victoria was talking about massive amounts of centralized data, and think of it as like a dystopian world, that a private company, that it was just completely acceptable for a private company to know all these things about you, and you don't even know what they know. You don't know what they know about you. It affects your life as you go to buy a car, get a car loan. There's just this mysterious data out there. The fact that this can go from being centralized either in a government or in a large corporation to being something that can be programmed into the data sharing itself, so that you can have control over, knowing when your data was shared, knowing how comfortable you are with, the different levels of sharing. I mean, truthfully, this may be a bad thing for me to be saying on this panel with this group of people, because typically the world of blockchain is very privacy focused, but I know that I'm lazy. I know that I like having passwords stored in a password manager, because I know that I'll forget them.
Megan, stop. Don't share that much, please. We don't know who's watching.
I know. But
I think what's interesting though, Megan, is what will be interesting to see what happens in the next 5 years is as Web3 matures and more people access it and transactions become more complex, and we move from a place where we're just checking a specific price point at a specific time to actually more complex data sets being disclosed and used, is how the industry matures around the liability models. So if you are trusting people for custodianship, which is what you're talking about, the equivalent of like a safety deposit box in the digital world, what does that look like when that goes wrong? Because it will, and it will happen, and let's accept it will, because it does happen in a real world now. Things do get taken from safety depositors and things go happen. But when you look at, sorry to go back to the loyalty stuff, but even when you look at the terms and conditions that sit behind a lot of complex and very well-funded blockchain companies, they deny all liability. Everything's got a massive double capital underlined printed disclaimer on there that says it's all at your own risk, and if this goes wrong, you're frozen out of your wallet, you've lost all your assets, and everything's gone. So for it to go mainstream and to get to a place where we are all living in this lovely metaverse and part of a data union, we've got to have some serious hard maturity conversations about what goes wrong, and we've got to accept that the reason why we have the fiscal rules that we have and why banks have to have reserve accounts and they have to have all of these requirements on them is because things have gone wrong and people have lost a hell of a lot of money and things have been difficult. So we also need to think about that, and I think that's what's really interesting about this new EU Data Act. And there's been a lot of press coverage from the tech industry about the so-called safeguards they want to put in around all of this data sharing. But we do need to have that policy debate around, if we want the average person on the street to start participating in this world and sharing information and being incentivized and rewarding it, what happens when it goes wrong? How are those issues solved? And if we're sharing information across jurisdictions and boundaries, what does that mean? Because what is my right to redress? If this is a company in Japan and I'm sat in Delaware in the US, what am I going to do? And how do I deal with that? And so there's some really challenging conversations ahead and a real maturity curve that's got to happen in the industry too, to be able to deal with that.
Yeah, Victoria, you make very good points, because although we are moving towards this Web3 model, in order for us to get there, I agree with you. I think regulations are necessary. And one of the biggest challenges we're facing today is just that lack of clarity with regulations. And I mean, that's just for the crypto and blockchain space in general. But yeah, I mean, does anybody else have any thoughts on maybe how we can combat that challenge, or any other challenges that should be mentioned as well, besides regulations?
Yeah, I mean, I do think also it's good to define that it's a different situation when you're talking about different types of data, and I think that in the world of blockchain, we'll sort of like swing from talking about financial, financial information and, all the more mature applications that, that happen as like within crypto as like a store of value, right? Versus like other types of data sharing. So, like if you're sharing health data, it's like a different set of consequences than if you're sharing the private keys to your, crypto wallet, which is different from sharing like, emails or chats, or, your kids are at work, it's like they're all sort of like different degrees of consequences.
Yeah.
I think that's, sorry, Ioana, you go.
No, it's fine, Chloe, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that that Megan's drawn on a really interesting point there regarding how many different types of data there are. So I was thinking originally that part of the hurdle is about, like when it comes to convenience, is about how we communicate it and how people are aware even at the kind of fundamental level of what is happening in the data economy and why it's important. But then there's like whole discussions to be had around the different types of data and then the potential for even that one type of data. And within that type of data, there are all the other types of data. So it's just like a kind of a gargantuan mission to take on. And I guess, obviously, I'm speaking from the perspective of data unions here as well, that by having kind of a collaborative working together, we can kind of address all of those as a kind of force and bring others in to develop and build on top. But I think also with as a data union, the most important element is really how well the community are engaged and how well it's understood, and also how well we've actually, made it clear what this mission is working towards. And fundamentally making it easy to use, because you need to get, like I mentioned, we have 250,000 people using Swash now, and that could be much more even in the very crypto-centric or data-centric world, or like the early adopter kind of world. But what happens when we get to like the average person on the street who maybe isn't so familiar with crypto wallets, for example? So everything we're trying to build out now, as Swash as a data union, but I've seen other data unions starting this as well. It's all about how to be as convenient as possible. Because Web2 has kind of shown us that convenience seems to overshadow everything else, unfortunately. But that's human nature. So I guess all of us being aware of that, and even when it comes to communicating terms and conditions, I guess even by design, those are not user-friendly currently. So even rethinking what that should look like, I think it's quite an exciting challenge. But yeah, that's the thing. There needs to be a lot of brains coming at that matter together.
Yeah, so Chloe, to your earlier point about various types of data sets and subsets and various types of data in itself, it took companies with billions of dollars in capital 2 or 3 years to come to terms with implementing GDPR. Now imagine a single person trying to navigate all of that data filtering ecosystem. It's practically impossible. That's why I said that simultaneously you need to develop the tools that would simplify it for the average person, because we keep on referencing the average person. Yes, the average person understands that the data is misused, that that data that the average person generates, consumes, etc., can and should be monetized with direct benefits for the average person, but that should be easy to do. The person doesn't need to understand, honestly, it doesn't need to go through years and years of trying to understand what types of data there are. And yes, from that perspective, the data union concept is the only way to move forward and aggregate all of the brains that you mentioned so that something can be developed, because we now have the tools and the construction, right? So we operate via DAOs, and we're increasingly moving towards that, towards stabilizing that, so that models and tools can be built to make it easier for the average person to monetize the data and take control over the data without spending too much time understanding what types of data they generate. And on the regulation side, I actually believe that I partially agree with that, because I don't think regulation solves everything. Regulators are the gap between what regulators understand when it comes to crypto and data and Web3 and what's actually happening in the ecosystem is huge. So if we are waiting for the regulators to intervene, we can wait for a very long time unless we kick off some a very intense education campaign directed at the said policymakers and regulators. What I think people should understand, the promise of crypto, and it's why I like it, is that it democratizes access for everyone to be able to create, deploy, use specific instruments. Of course, it's mostly around finance these days, that were before restricted to a particular type of users, and for a good cause. Now, with that democratization and full access comes a lot of responsibility. If an individual wants to benefit from an open system, they should spend enough time to educate themselves. And what I think, us as part of the industry should do is offer those resources. We cannot just, if we go back to saying, the state should intervene, regulators should educate. No. People want freedom of choice. People want access to everything. Then they should also educate themselves. So I think it's a combination. I don't disagree that there should be some regulatory parameters, but I think there's a combination between the state or the industry intervening with some parameters and individuals educating themselves and trying to understand the ecosystem better. I mean, it's great when you make a lot of money. It's horrible when you lose. So maybe try to find a balance and prepare yourself better if you want to have access to all of that. So that's.
I think what's going to happen is there's quite an interesting political situation that will happen, because you will obviously have jurisdictions which espouse those values exactly that Ioana said, is about democracy and all of those types of things, and the rights of the individual and the rights for freedom of contract and all sorts of things like that. I think when you come to other jurisdictions that have a different type of political setup, this will very much challenge the core of how those societies operate and think. And so it will be very interesting to see what happens in those jurisdictions and how they interact in this space, and what happens with the ability of corporates and citizens to interact. Because obviously, I mean, from my time in Singapore, I think it's an amazing country and has so much to offer in this space, and they've been very smart about their data protection laws, their strategy, their embracing of blockchain and crypto economies, and providing a bridge within that region for those industries to grow. But when you think about what citizens in Singapore accept with the government and their access to data, that will provide challenges if you're thinking about concepts that we've talked about.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead, Megan.
Go ahead. I also think that in some ways, like, the regulation that we've seen in the past was sort of like preempting the technology that we have now. So like a lot of the reasons to have GDPR is because you know, your data is going into a company and you should have some rights to revoke that. And, you know, a potentially, like, I would argue, like, much more elegant solution, rather than have that be something that is handled by regulation, is something that's handled by technology. So if you are sharing your information on the blockchain and then you are able to revoke it, you don't have to, you know, rely on the EU to be, you know, to be going after companies to do that. And then you sort of avoid those risks of just calcifying the large companies who have the capabilities to enforce GDPR, and squashing all new companies who are coming up who are like not able to handle that level of complexity.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with just education, which is why we're having this panel discussion today. We want to educate the public on Web3 and data and what that means. So there's obviously a lot more that can be done aside from regulations. That being said, I know we have a few minutes left before we open the panel discussion up to the audience questions. So do you ladies have any final thoughts on maybe what the future of Web3 data looks like, or what we can expect moving forward? Anyone? Chloe?
I mean, I definitely think that one of the things that's really fun about working in this space is that, like, maybe you guys are have better insights into this, but like, I feel like I am always surprised with the next big thing that blows up. Like, I never would have expected NFTs to be one of the like huge use cases of smart contracts, and to be, you know, the kind of phenomenon that they are. And so I'm just really excited to see what happens next. It does really feel like the early days of the internet, where people are just building weird stuff, and I love that, right? Like, I love being in like the era of like the hamster dance, you know, like, and I just can't wait to see what gets built next, and the different ways that the novel abilities to share data while aligning incentives, or share data and like incentivize people in these new ways, like the stuff that comes up around that.
I think I really feel like we are in a period of enlightenment and renaissance. I really do. It's the historical equivalent of that, with what can happen in this new world order of how we empower each other with sharing information and how we collaborate. And that is a fundamental rethinking of how we interact and how we trade and how we go about the things that we want to do. And that is really exciting. And much like Megan said, there's real creativity that can come with that. and there's a lot of money being invested in this space, so people are going a little bit crazy with it, and it will eventually figure out it's through that curve. But I think there's huge potential in people coming together and collaborating, and that's what's really exciting about Swash and the data union concept, because it enables people to form those collaborative engagements and come together in seeing what the value is in their shared common views and their shared data.
Yes, I agree. Collaboration, creativity. I'm fascinated by the human intelligence potential that I see every single day in every single product that is being released, probably daily or weekly. And like I said, I mean, those were the primitives for Web 1, but we now have the correct monetization models, or we're trying to build them. So we've understood what went wrong in a prior version of the internet. So we're via decentralization, we're trying to fix it. I see the future. So I think in the future we'll be talking about Web 25, or I don't know. There will be so many iterations. I think the reality and the way we perceive reality is going to be very different. I see blurred lines between virtual reality and the analog world. Similarly, I see again a symbiosis or a hybridization between fiat rails and crypto, powered by some notion of what we now call the Metaverse. I do believe decentralized autonomous organization in one form or the other, so I mean we're still very early, will be central into running this new ecosystem. And yeah, I guess I'm really excited to see what type of infrastructure will be built to support all of that. And I also believe, yes, of course, user centricity and people extracting value out of something that they weren't aware they were in a position to extract value from, which is what we have been talking about for 40 minutes, data. But I also believe the generational gap will be huge. So I have an almost 11, she's turning 11, my daughter, she's a video gamer. She's embedded in all the cool P2E and all sorts of video games. I mean, I'm lucky to be part of this industry because I can still communicate with her on the same level. But I feel other parents won't have that privilege because the gap will be huge. They operate so the new generation operates differently, has very different social norms, interrelations, interdependencies that are all powered by tech in a new format. So yeah, I am excited for the future. I am excited to be in this space. And actually, a few hours before the panel, I had a call with Krista Kim, who's an amazing artist, and she said something that's very, very interesting. She said that it feels Web3 and decentralized technologies are very much consistent with female aggregation ethos, So it feels females are perfectly matched with this culture. And I completely agree with that. I have been experiencing it, but she said it so eloquently. She said it better, I think, but for sure. But I'm just transmitting the message. And it's true. So I see a lot of females constantly being empowered via all of these sorts of projects that are powered by decentralization. So that's great to see.
I love that. I think there's a lot to say about like the kind of power of collaboration, and I guess that iteration and like the appetite to keep iterating, keep building and experimenting and see what comes next is sort of what's driving all of this forward. I think I also agree that I think in the future there will become a point where like the younger generations, like Ioana's saying, they'll be like, how did you let this happen? How was this normal when you were a kid? And I guess in that sense as well, whether we're talking about gaming as a good example, there's certain elements built into, that way of thinking when you're playing a game, for example, that ownership is sort of more natural, even though it's like intangible when you're playing that game. You have a sword or something, but you believe it's yours and it doesn't really need to be a real thing. And that's, of course, a whole conversation about NFTs. But I think underlining whatever comes next is the fact that we need information, and data is that kind of foundational layer of what is kind of underpinning, whether it's DeFi or NFTs or whatever the next big thing will be. So I think regardless of what the next trend is or whatever the thing is that gets another wave of the mainstream audiences involved, I think that discussion for data and the role of data unions, and of course what all of us are kind of advocating for here as well, is crucial. So bringing in the elements together.
Right. Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, all of you make such great points. We have about 5 minutes left for the panel discussion. So I just wanted to take at least one question from the audience. And this is actually a great question because it kind of transitions into what we were just talking about. Any recommendations on how to make the jump from Web 2 to Web 3? I recently wrote a great article on Cointelegraph about Web 3 developers, for instance, hit an all-time high last year based on a report in 2021. So if you ladies have any recommendations on how people, not only developers, can make the move into Web 3 from Web 2, feel free to enlighten us.
So, like I said, for me personally, that's just my view. The metaverse or metaverses is a very clear representation of Web3 tech and what it can enable. If we look at the metaverse, there are so many verticals: digital fashion, NFTs, gaming, traditional gaming, play to earn. The promise of creating an open economic system with entity to entity intra-metaverse value transfer. That's amazing. I mean, you can find, out of all of the things that I've just mentioned, there are so many things that people can attach themselves to. Digital fashion, like I said, many people and many women in the fashion industry are now transitioning to digital fashion. Many women in the gaming industry, be it traditional or P2E, are now transitioning into the metaverse and starting to deploy and understand Web3 tech. There are many, many things. Like you said, Victoria, you think of this as the Renaissance. I actually think the metaverse in itself feels like we've just conquered a planet and we're redesigning everything from scratch. Or to be perfectly honest, I felt like that before I heard China bought a couple of patents in the metaverse. Now I'm not so idealistic about it anymore. But yeah, I mean, we have the chance to redesign almost everything from scratch. So I guess every single thing that you do in the Web 2 world can find a reinterpretation via Web3 model in the metaverse. And I just gave a couple of examples, but if people want to chat about this, I'm happy to continue the convo.
I think Rachel, there's huge. So my top tip is go find your local university, your higher education. There's huge amounts of groups that are out there for people to get involved and get engaged with, and that was how my journey started. I mean, I was just a sad tech lawyer, and someone sent me an email and said, "There's something called blockchain, Victoria, and we're doing something on it." And so my instant thing as that kind of bookworm girl, I went and rocked up at the National University of Singapore and signed myself up for a little bit of a course, and I found myself sat next to a 70-year-old woman who was learning how to program her first crypto wallet back in 2017, and that's the experience. Go get engaged. UCL, the London Blockchain Foundation, which I'm a founder member of. There's huge amounts of groups wherever you are across the world. Find an association and get engaged and start a conversation. And I've found this community, much like Ioana said, is very embracing of people who are curious and ask questions. And you don't need to have a PhD. You don't need to have any knowledge whatsoever. It is out there and it is accessible, and a lot of it is free. So just dive into it.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, Megan, were you going to add to that?
Oh, I was going to add to that. Yeah. Like, I actually think that like the Web3 world is not as user-friendly as the Web 2 world, which, it will get there. There's still like a barrier. But I would even say like one step below going to, a university and figuring out, what's happening is like, just go mess around with things. I think that like, I think that like the two big ways that, people go from Web 2 to Web 3 is like, you either find something like silly and weird that you're super into that you want to figure out how to do, and then you go like figure out how to, then go play with it, and then that's your intro to Web 3, or you find something that you're really pissed off about in Web 2, and then you're working around how to not have that anymore. I think that those are like the main paths for developers and non-developers both.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Megan, you make a really good point. Also, it's not as user-friendly, which is another point that I wrote about in that Cointelegraph article, but that shouldn't deter people away from it. I mean, this is the future, and companies are inviting and they're actively seeking out individuals to join them with Web3 development. I know we're actually almost out of time, but I'm going to take one last question from the audience member, Rena. They're asking, do you think data unions and data DAOs can turn data monetization for everyday internet users to a new form of UBI? That's a great question. So if you ladies can shed some insight on that, that would be greatly appreciated.
But I think there are already programs in that space, and I think there's a good source of those in Latin America and in Africa, where they've been experimenting in this space for education data, for health data, and for various different user sets to try and help people think about how they can get to a point where by sharing this information and assets, they have a basic income. And I definitely think especially in emerging markets, this is where you will see huge growth and potential. And even where you're even seeing the UN and the experiments that they have around some of their crypto projects and blockchain projects, they're looking at this already. And I think that's really exciting, and how you can also incentivize people to look after the environment as well and provide them an income with that is really, really powerful. With some of the care for animals and for the environment and how we farm and in agriculture, it will end up being more rewarding for people to behave in the certain ways that we want to protect our environment and still get an economy going from that is sustainable. And that is really, really interesting, how you can use some of these models to achieve these huge goals that we have around our standards for our planet.
I just jump in there as well. The idea of like how to incentivize people, I think, is really interesting that Victoria is mentioning. And I guess also like that, like, for example, one thing we're trying to do with Swash and we're going to release this year is this idea of data for good. Because, you know, maybe for some people, what earnings they might have through Swash wouldn't be enough that it's notable, whereas for other countries it might be. There's this idea that regardless of your earnings, you can still choose to then donate a certain percentage to a charity, or you can kind of, as a collective, you'll see what all the other data union members are supporting, and you know what kind of impact that can have. This is something we're sort of exploring in the early days at the moment, but I think as we start, when people actually see like the results of the impact they have, whether it's with charities or again in that kind of DAO structure, it's very promising, and I think again very close to the ethos of data unions and DAOs, but and then generally with Web3, you know, in all areas of Web3.
I think one project I'd point to is the Trillion Trees project, which is a fantastic project and is backed by the G20 nations, which is about enabling people to through planting trees and caring for trees, that then rewards them in an education platform, and they get money subsidizing their education. So that is a fantastic loop. And there is a blockchain element to that. And then there is also a blockchain element of tokenized carbon, then continuing to be a lovely loop that supports them on their education journey and providing them funding to go forward. So by caring for the planet, supporting the Trillion Trees planting, and all of that good stuff that comes with it, it then enables them to improve their education, get access to finance to be able to support them. And you can start to see how these models can come together in a really, really powerful way. And that's the potential here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much potential. There's so many amazing projects out there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Otherwise, we could keep the discussion going. So I just want to say thank you again to the audience for joining us. Thank you, Swash, for hosting us, and to Chloe for organizing. Thank you to all of you ladies for joining us today for this wonderful panel discussion. Chloe, before we end the discussion. Do you want to add a few final thoughts as a conclusion?
No, I'm just thank you all for joining. Like, of course, for our wonderful panelists. This is the first event that we've hosted natively with Swash, and we intend to have many more moving forward. So hope you all enjoyed. And yeah, great comments, great questions from everyone. And I'm excited for the next one. And thank you so much, Rachel, for moderating.
Of course, thank you. And remember, this will be recorded. So Chloe, you'll send that out, and just follow Swash app on Twitter for updates. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, ladies. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.